While I was in Virginia, the government had a plan whereby you could get your license to fly in a small plane through the University of Virginia. And they had let me participate in that program. And that's where I learned to fly one of these little light planes. So then when the time came and we had to register for the draft, I went over to Norfolk, Virginia, where there was an air base, and I tried to volunteer for the United States Air Force. They put me through all of the tests, and I passed everything in flying colors except my eyes. My normal eyesight was good, but in those days we weren't in war. They wanted you to be absolutely perfect. So the last thing they did was put these belladonna drops in your eyes, which I understand expand your pupils, and they can take a bright light and scan down in there to the back of your skull. And they advised me that they couldn't take me because I had a weakness there. In the next few years, my eyes would go bad. Bear in mind now that the allocation for the entire States Air Force at that time, I understand, was only around 2,000 pilots or something like that. And they would only take the guys who were absolutely perfect, including this belladonna drops test. I couldn't believe that that would keep me out. Anyway, I hopped in the car and drove down to Tampa, Florida, where my brother Buddy was in the United States Air Force and had a permanent commission as a second lieutenant. And he had arranged for me to have another test down there. I thought, well, maybe I could pass it down there. But unfortunately for me, the results were exactly the same. And there was no way that they would accept me. And that was the only thing that kept me out, which incidentally, after war was declared, that was the first thing they quit doing, because if they hadn't, there wouldn't be enough men to man the airplanes. I knew that if we got into war, and it sure looked like we were going to get into war, that I would be drafted. I was just the right age, single, and everything else. And now that I couldn't get in the United States Air Force, and I knew how to fly a plane, and that's what I wanted to do, I had no choice other than to go up to Canada in a hurry before I did get drafted, and see if they would have me and take me in to train me as a military pilot. So I went before the draft board, which I had already had to be registered in Charlottesville, Virginia, and asked permission to go to Canada, and I received it. So with that, I parked my car at a filling station and grabbed a bus and went up to Windsor, Ontario. That's right opposite Detroit, where I crossed the border and was welcomed into the Royal Canadian Air Force. I discovered that a lot of Americans, and it seemed to me mainly Texas, were crossing the border there to do the same thing that I did. So they gave us a place to eat and sleep at the YMCA till they could get us organized. And it took a few days, at which time in the meantime I used to go down to the docks and help load these big freighters to pick up some beer money. It was tough work, but we were young and tough, and it worked out all right. Finally, we were shipped off to what they call a Manning Depot. That's kind of a staging area. It was in Toronto, and we were built it in the old exhibition grounds, which they hold every year, and they still do, incidentally. And it was just finishing up at the end of August. So we wound up there in the first part of September, and they had put up double bunks in the old cow palace, they call it, where all the cattle had been built. And they had sleeping room for 5,000 men in that one big room, and they were all full. From there, we were individually screened as to what we wanted to do, and we had to take various tests. And the guys that didn't make it for pilots were sent to one school, and the ones that they thought might be a pilot were sent to initial training, which is no flying yet, but all book work to learn about navigation, and we had to learn the dot and dash SOS code, because in those days they didn't have all the modern communication instruments that they have today. So finally, I wound up in elementary flying in these little light biplanes in St. Eugene, Ontario, a little French town that looked to me like it only had about 100 people in it. But there was a drugstore, some summer type store there that boys could, if they had a chance to walk into. It was a couple of miles from the airport. And if they had any money, buy a little something, although they didn't have much to sell, stuff that we would want, such as cigarettes and candy and stuff like that. So I finally passed my elementary flying, and I went on up to Ottawa, Ontario, for advanced flying, which they use the Americans call it the AT-6. It's the Harvard Advanced Trainer. It's a good plane, and that's where I got my wings, which incidentally were presented by a former World War I ace, Billy Bishop, in person, because his son was in my graduating class and got his wings there, although he had cracked up about a half a dozen planes in training, but he still got his wings. And since I was a little older than some of them, they wanted me to stay there and be an instructor pilot, which I adamantly told them I really didn't want to do that. I didn't say I wouldn't. I couldn't say that I wouldn't, because I might make me do it or kick me out. I didn't want that to happen, but I respectfully asked them if I couldn't go overseas. And after a long time and a lot of discussion, they finally okayed it. So with that, I was shipped to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and shipped over to dear old Blighty, England. And I arrived there, I guess it was about September of 1942, and was assigned to 184 Squadron. From there, we flew up to an airfield about 40 miles south of the Scottish border. This is where they trained us to become proficient in the use of the guns or cannon that we had on our airplane, and also a lot of training in combat tactics. After we became sufficiently proficient in that, they then sent us up to, back down south to an airfield at Manston, Kent. It's the airfield closest to the French coast, and right on the English Channel, where the estuary comes right in towards London, just outside of Dover. We now were given a lot of training in very, very low-level flying, and we made our first combat trip, which consisted of flying at about 2 feet over the water towards Hancel, Belgium, where the Germans were sending these little coaster ships down from the Norway and going into the harbor there, John Lewis. And that was our job, to intercept them. This was about 100 miles from our airfield, and we usually took off before daylight so that we would get over there just about the time it was getting daylight. That's when they usually tried to come in. On the way back, we would normally see hundreds of small little boats down there fishing. And of course, this is what provided the people over there with enough food to live on. And we naturally did not bother any of these unless it had an aerial on it. If it had an aerial, we would shoot it up because that meant that they were transmitting information to the military. But this rarely ever happened. We then started pulling low-level daylight raids over France to shoot up enemy convoys, trains, gun positions, or just anything that we saw that might be connected with the military. And oftentimes we'd see troops being transported in trucks and stuff like that. Your danger point here was going into the land and coming out. Once you got past the coastline inside France, you didn't have to worry too much about flak. You had to watch out for fighters, of course. But coming out was very tricky because the Germans had the whole coastline loaded with guns, and they were very, very good at them. So coming out, we would still be low level so that they couldn't track us until we got close to them. It would take about, a short time to spot us. Their radar would pick us up when we were about 4 miles away. But at the speed we were going, they didn't have much time to shoot at us. Once we crossed that coast, though, and they could see us, they would follow us right out with those guns. So what we did was what we call fishtailing. You'd hold a steady course for just about 1 second. Then you'd flip over to the right and back straight again. We call this fishtailing. You hold it about a second and you do it again. Every time you flip back over there, and you could look out to your left side and you'd see all those bullets. Oh, it looked to me like about 1 million of them going by you every time. So if you ever made the mistake of flying straight and level too long, you were a dead duck. Our intelligence people tried to keep us informed about the location of the various German gun positions on the French coast so that we would try to pick a spot naturally in between. However, the Germans had mobile units, and you couldn't depend on this. For instance, Flight Lieutenant Roughhead in my squadron and led 3 other guys over on a low-level raid one afternoon. And they run right into one of these gun positions, and they shot down 3 out of 4. They got, only 2 of them got inside. They shot Roughhead down as he was going in, and his number 2 man. The other 2 men were over in France for a while, but when they came out, they shot down 1 other. So, Flying Officer Carr was the only guy that got back to England alive that day. So we did have some rough days with that. Another sad case was a young New Zealand pilot they sent over to join our squadron to replace one of our lost men. And on his first low-level trip over to France during one of our daylight raids, we saw him come out of France all right with the rest of us. But we got home, and he never showed up. The only thing we could figure out was that at low level, he must have been trying to set his compass, which in a hurricane, you kind of had to lean over your joystick to get to it. So we figured he must have touched his joystick and pitched him right into the channel. So this is really a sad day for a young guy to get lost on his first mission, something like that, not even with bullets. But that's one of the freakish things that happen once in a while. After operating at mast and tent for a while, they decided to give us typhoons in place of our hurricanes. This is a great single-engine fighter bomber. It had 4 20-millimeter cannons in the wings and 8 60-pound explosive rocket heads under the wings. They could drop those plates that the rockets were on and put a 1,000-pound bomb under each wing instead, if they wanted to. So they really equipped us to be a tank buster squadron, and we were going to be assigned to take care of the tanks on major pushes after the invasion.